somewhere in a textbook or a museum or a documentary you half watched as a kid, you've seen a cave painting. A horse, a bison, maybe a mammoth. And next to it, almost always ignored, a handful of dots. Little marks that everyone, historians, tour guides, that documentary narrator, quietly assumed were decoration, or doodles, or nothing at all. The leftover scratches of a species that hadn't invented language yet, never mind writing. Here's what nobody tells you. Those dots weren't nothing. In 2023, a team of researchers cracked what those marks actually mean, and the answer wasn't decoration. It was data. Specifically, it was a calendar, a working, lunar, cross-continental calendar built by hunter-gatherers at least 20,000 years ago, roughly 10,000 years before anyone thought humans had invented anything close to writing. This is the story of the man who broke that code, the number hiding inside every single cave in Europe, and why primitive might be the single most misleading word in the history of archaeology. The person who cracked this wasn't an archaeologist. Ben Bacon restored furniture for a living in London. No university post, no excavation experience, just a private fascination with those dots that had bothered professionals for over a century. He started doing something almost embarrassingly simple: counting. Across hundreds of cave paintings, reindeer, wild horses, salmon, an extinct type of cattle called an aurochs, he tallied every dot, every line, every strange little mark placed next to each animal. Then he looked for a pattern. And a pattern showed up almost immediately. In every single sequence he examined, across caves separated by hundreds of miles and thousands of years, the count of marks never went above 13. 13 isn't a random ceiling. There are 13 lunar months in a solar year. Bacon wasn't looking at art criticism, he was looking at a counting system. To his credit, Bacon didn't just publish a blog post and call it proven. He brought the pattern to Tony Freeth, a mathematician who had already done something almost unbelievable. He'd helped decode the Antikythera mechanism, the 2,000-year-old Greek device so mechanically advanced that for centuries scholars assumed it had to be a hoax. If anyone knew how to prove an ancient counting system was real and not wishful pattern matching, it was him. Freeth, along with archaeologists Paul Pettit and Robert Kentridge at Durham University, spent months testing the theory against the data instead of the other way around. They pulled over 800 sequences of marks from more than 600 pieces of Ice Age cave art across Europe, and the correlation held. The number of marks beside a given animal tracked almost exactly the number of lunar months between a fixed starting point, likely the depths of winter, and that specific animal's mating season. Look at one specific case. In the Lascaux caves in France, there's a painting of an aurochs, an enormous, now extinct wild ox that seems to gallop across an 18-foot wall. Painted across its back, 4 small dots. Isolated, that number means nothing. Cross-referenced against the known mating season of that species, it lines up. Go to Pendal Cave in northern Spain and there's an engraving of a salmon, made roughly 17,000 years ago, marked with 3 lines. Different animal, different cave, different continent-spanning distance from Lascaux, and the same underlying counting logic. Then there's the symbol that took the theory from interesting to system. A simple diverging line shaped like a Y appears again and again next to these sequences. Bacon's hypothesis, later supported by the data, was that it marked something specific: birth. Not just this animal exists here, but this is when this animal gives birth here. Put that together and what you're looking at isn't a picture of an animal, it's a record. Species, timing window, reproductive event. Painted on stone, tens of thousands of years before anyone invented a page to write it on. Now, it would be dishonest to hand you this as a settled fact with no pushback, because there is pushback, and it matters. Some archaeologists, including researchers like April Noel, argue this doesn't quite earn the label writing. Full writing systems carry grammar, nouns, verbs, the ability to build new sentences out of old symbols. What Bacon's team found is closer to a fixed code, a small set of symbols with consistent meanings, but not yet a flexible language you could use to say something entirely new. It's proto-writing, a serious, data-backed system for recording information, just not the full thing. That distinction matters, and it's worth sitting with instead of skipping past for a bigger headline. But even the more conservative version of this finding is enormous. Even not quite writing still means Ice Age humans were deliberately encoding structured, repeatable, cross-regional information onto a surface for other people or for themselves later to read back. That's not cave art, that's infrastructure. Here's the part that should actually unsettle the way you think about human history. The standard timeline taught for over a century put the first writing systems in Mesopotamia, roughly 5,000 years ago. Cuneiform, wedges pressed into wet clay, invented so early temple accountants could track grain. This system predates that by at least 10,000 years. Not a close call. Not a few centuries of academic squabbling over dates. An entire extra chapter of human intelligence gathering, sitting in plain sight on cave walls that tourists have been walking past with flashlights for over 100 years, assuming the marks were meaningless. And think about what that calendar actually did for the people who built it. It wasn't decoration. It wasn't ritual for its own sake. It was survival infrastructure. Knowing exactly which lunar month a herd would be vulnerable, pregnant, gathered at a specific breeding ground, that's the difference between a successful hunt and a starving winter. These weren't people doodling to pass the time in a dark cave. They were running a resource management system, thousands of years before anyone had a word for data. So next time a photo of a cave painting shows up in a documentary or a textbook or a museum wall you're walking past, look past the horse and the bison. Look for the dots. For over a century, everyone standing in front of those marks assumed they were looking at the leftovers of a species still catching up. A group of hunter-gatherers who hadn't figured out language, hadn't figured out writing, hadn't figured out much of anything except how to survive one season to the next. They'd actually built a calendar accurate enough to predict when an animal species hundreds of miles away would give birth. And they did it in the dark, on stone, with nothing but careful observation and a system for writing down what they'd learned. We didn't teach them to count. If anything, it's starting to look like the opposite.